Just want to thank everybody for joining us today for the Walk Massachusetts Network. This is for August 21st, 2024. Stephanie, whenever you're ready, you're good to go.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. My name is Stefanie Seskin. I am the Director of Policy and Practice at NACTO, which stands for the National Association of City Transportation Officials. I also am on the board of WalkMassachusetts and am a real nerd for transportation. So I am glad to be here with all of you. In preparing for this, I realize I probably have like 150 slides worth of content because I, as aforementioned, am a super transportation nerd. So I wanted to try to get a sense if folks could share in the chat or however else they're allowed to share, just if you're familiar with the manual and uniform traffic control devices, also called the MUTCD, if you are or aren't, if there's anything specific that you're interested in me sharing a bit more about. So I have this like massive slide deck, and I will just go where the crowd would best like me to go. And that question is also open to Emma and Brendan on staff to also give me some direction on what they would want to hear about.
I think one thing I'd love to hear about is like, what has changed and why does that matter? And I think that's always helpful for me.
Yeah, well, how about I start with that, and with folks who, feel free to add in the chat as we're going about what you'd like to hear. Okay, so you should now be seeing presentation slides. So the manual uniform traffic control devices, the most recent edition was released in December, but became sort of like official in January of this year. This is the first time that the manual has been updated in over a decade. And yeah, that is kind of a problem. Some of the changes that we've all been seeing and advocating for in our communities for a very long time, were still deemed experimental or weird in the parlance of 2024. So one of the things that happened were a number of advocates like yourselves got together and had a campaign to tell your federal reps, hey, like this is actually a problem. Like this is getting in the way of us building the communities that we want to see. And so now updates to the MUTCD are required by law every 4 years. But key thing here, states have 2 years to adopt the latest version. So you might actually be on a 6-year time frame instead of a 4-year. There is also a challenge here of how much can actually be updated in 4 years. I'm not going to pull up the PDF for everyone, but there's like 1,100 pages of pretty dense content. And so, imagining having to update that every 4 years is, causing some heart rates to increase at the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration staff side. And so what's most likely to happen is that in 4 years, what we'll get is like the 11th edition, version 2, with some minor changes. So don't get too excited about the potential for something brand new in 4 years. I think it's helpful to know how we got here. So the 11th edition, while the manual predates the 70s, the 11th edition we can really trace back to 1971, which was the last like comprehensive rewrite In the very early days, there were a lot of differences of opinions about how we should be signing and marking our roads. We took a lot of inspiration actually from rail. So that's why red, yellow, green, those were the colors that we used to build out railway systems. And so we just kind of translated them to a more urban environment. But we also had differences of opinion, like what color should a stop sign be? It in some places was yellow. And then they were like, well, maybe it should be the same color across states so that people, when they see it, they know what it means regardless. So that's like the origins. We had the big comprehensive rewrite in the 70s. The 10th edition, as I mentioned, came out like 15 years before. In that time period between the 10th edition and where we are now, the Federal Highway Administration issued some things called interim approvals. And so these are pretty short documents that basically say, oh, like something new has come out or has been shown promise, and here are the rules for using it. Some things that you might be familiar with are rectangular flashing beacons, so the wigwag ped signs, red on transit lanes, using some different colors and tools on our streets. But the understanding was kind of varied, and you really had to know there was a whole like drama around the interim approvals for those RFBs, for example. In the previous administration under President Trump, the Federal Highway Administration finally put out a proposal to update the manual that included these interim approvals and began to address some other emerging concerns. However, it kind of came out of what felt like nowhere to a lot of people. There was no conversation, and certainly once you get into federal rulemaking, the folks who work at Federal Highway Administration are like by law not allowed to have discussions and conversations. So a lot of things are happening in the background. My organization now, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, partnered with a lot of other advocacy groups like America Walks and Transportation for America to really like develop us a campaign where we had regular folks like I was going to say like us, but I know that we're not regular folks because we're here at the WalkMass network, but advocates, professionals across all sizes of government send in comments about like some of the really weird stuff that was in the proposed MUTCD. And a lot of that got changed. And that's where we come out most recently, those 25,000 comments that were submitted turned into some pretty cool changes, some that still need to happen. Talked about that. Okay. So from the NACTO perspective, we had like these kind of core things that we asked for. We wanted the document to be fundamentally restructured so that it was proactive on safety. We wanted to modernize how cities and towns and states should set speed zones, which are, wherever the speed limit isn't the default, how do you decide what that is? We wanted to make it easier to install crosswalks and pedestrian signals. We were alarmed that there was a brand new section introduced on automated vehicles that had no input from cities or people who would be encountering these vehicles on their streets. We wanted some of those interim approvals to be finalized, including green bike lanes and red transit lanes, but we also were like pushing pretty hard for the federal government to like finally understand that street murals and art on our streets was not a traffic control device, and that cities and towns should be able to make up their minds about where they want to do that. There are restrictions in the previous manual that continue today that where and how you can design certain bikeways. And we also wanted them to really think big about like, hey, you just got 25,000 comments. Like this, something like there's a lot of interest, and this like one-way flow of information is not working. So what did we get? This is some background stuff. Okay, we'll start here. So this is a big new section on target road users that changed. So previously the manual was very focused on the fact that humans should behave perfectly. You should expect people to always be paying attention, to have 100% control over their bodies, their vehicles, the people that they're with, and anyone who has ever like walked down the street with someone who is, I don't know, probably under the age of 16 knows that you can't control everyone that you're working with. Maybe you also have a dog that like wants to go sniff something. That's just not feasible. And so the book did change in this opening section to include more people, both inside and outside of vehicles, and to like explicitly recognize that people are coming into this with a whole lot of other things happening, whether that's a disability, another impairment, but also just like we're humans, like we're just taking in a lot of information at any time, and how are we supposed to be able to respond kind of changes. And so this was a really great change. Could it go further? Yes. But I think this gives a lot of credence to what Walk Massachusetts and its network has been pushing for a long time, which is just like people are in the world like behaving. You can't expect them to have read this 1,100-page document and understand exactly how they're supposed to be behaving at any given time and to have full control over everything. Instead, you should be treating them as like normal people, as your everyday road user. Another part of this that I want to really highlight, especially for people who are advocates, is that while this manual does require like following the rules, it's not a replacement for proper engineering judgment. A lot of people will sort of hide behind this manual and be like, oh, well, the manual says, and the manual might say that, but it might say that in a way that one isn't what we call a standard, which is like, you shall do this thing. It might say something more like, evidence shows that X or Y, you should do it this way. That's one thing. The second thing is that even if you want to do something that is in direct, like, contradiction to what's in the manual, you can. If you're an engineer and you go through an engineering study, or you submit a request to experiment, you can. And on top of that, if the roadway is owned by your city or town, and you're not using federal funds, you have a lot more leeway than you would on, let's say, like a state road or a project that has federal funding for it. So in a lot of cities, engineers already make decisions on a day-to-day basis that are not 100% aligned with the manual. So the book could go further in emphasizing this, but I think it's important for everyone to know. I'm also going to talk about speed limits because this is like a really huge change that happened. So we, speed limits for a long time were sort of argued over about like how best to decide how fast people driving should be. But the sort of standard that came about, again, not really based on like real research or anything recent, was to use something called the 85th percentile. And that's where if you have drivers, most of whom are going 55, the speed limit should be 55. Without regard to the fact that like, maybe it actually shouldn't be 55 because this is by an elementary school, and we know that children, their brains are not actually able to comprehend how fast cars are going. They really don't know. And so that seems like a pretty big conflict, a 55-mile-per-hour 2-ton vehicle coming at a 6-year-old. These are things that are decided through an engineering study. What has changed is, this is a lot of text. This is the text directly from the book, is kind of this big section, and I want to draw a special attention to the sentence that says the engineering study shall consider the roadway context. This is a huge, huge win. I know some people wanted this to go further, but this really outlines exactly the things that you are supposed to care about as the person who's making the decision about speed limits. You have to be thinking about the environment around the road, public transportation. You have to be thinking about lane widths. You have to think about, are you in like the downtown of a town? Or are you like going through a beautiful countryside farmland where you're not really encountering a lot of other users? You should also, if you're thinking about how people are traveling, if you're going to think about the 85th percentile, maybe also think about, you know, the 50th percentile. What is that median that people are going at, not the like higher end of how people are traveling? And basically, for almost all contexts where you might expect a pedestrian, the 85th percentile speed should not be used to set speed limits. And that's that text at the very bottom in paragraph 9. Unless you have thought about everything else, that's not how you're going to make a decision. And in Massachusetts, that is really important. MassDOT has been making slow and steady progress in changing how cities and towns can set speeds. But still was heavily reliant on using this 85th percentile measure as a way to go about setting those speed limits. On top of that, in the absence of like clear recommendations counter to the 85th percentile, there was a lot of, well, how do you know that you should be choosing a different speed limit? And this is exactly how you would know. So these are some resources that cities can use. So obviously I'm going to hype our own document here called City Limits. This came out almost 4 years ago. It's data supported. It draws from real examples across North America about how cities and towns are setting speed limits. It covers a lot of different ways to set speed limits, but there is a chapter in there around corridors and speed zones. The other tool that also already exists is something called US Limits 2. I believe that limits actually stands for something. I don't know what it is, but basically it's an expert systems tool where you put in some numbers and then the algorithm runs and then it spits out a recommendation for you that's based on your traffic volumes, your driveways, your presence of pedestrians, your context, and gives you something that actually is like pretty good for something that's a little bit of a black box. FHWA is making some additional guidance, which they referenced back in December when they issued the manual. But then they still haven't published it, but you will know when it comes out, and hopefully it will be good. We'll see. The other thing that I'm going to talk about quickly to start before I run through, there's a lot of stuff in the chat, is around crosswalk markings. So there is some new guidance from the Federal Highway Administration that supports across the board using higher visibility crosswalks. So those are ones that have the lines that, if you're a pedestrian, are sort of perpendicular to how you're walking. Those are better for drivers to be able to see because there's more, basically there's more white on the pavement so you can see it. It doesn't go quite so far as to say that you should always use it. And I will say the MUTCD also leaves a lot of room to be desired in doing this. However, one of the big changes is that previously the manual would say, don't put in a crosswalk. It doesn't matter that pedestrians are already here. You're not allowed to because it's a 4-lane road. It's too busy, whatever. Instead, now the manual says what's actually more aligned with what the Federal Highway Administration has been saying for almost as long as since the last manual edition came out, which is if the street is too fast, busy, or wide for just a marked crosswalk alone, you should make it slower, narrower, or you should raise the crosswalk. And that's aligned with the STEP guide, which is both a pocket tool and a larger tool that helps identify different types of pedestrian crossings based on the context that you're in. The other thing that the manual made explicit, which helps to support more crosswalks in locations where people need them, are to be able to do what they're calling sidewalk extensions. Most of us would call them curb extensions, but this specifically means space in the roadway that is where pedestrians should be expected to be, and built with relatively low-cost flexible tools like thermoplastic paint, flexible delineator posts, and like really formalizes this practice in a way that reflects the extremely widespread use of it, but supports that change elsewhere in the manual on where and how you can install crosswalks. This is a little bit more technical, so I'm going to skip it. But then the other thing to know is asphalt art. It is explicitly allowed. This isn't like, well, there was this clarification memo that someone sent to a municipality in Vermont 5 years ago that we're going to reference. The manual itself says that the manual doesn't care. The feds don't care. So long as you are meeting these kinds of rules. So don't confuse pedestrians with vision disabilities. Don't use the colors that are meant to convey other things. So don't create this space, paint it red and pretend that it's not for buses. Don't paint it green and pretend it's not for bikes. Don't advertise in the right of way. Basically just like, it's art. It's not meant to communicate anything about how traffic is moving. Go for it. And that's a really big win, especially for communities that are working to build community around your streets. So coming together as neighbors to do a mural, to design a long-term intervention like the one that just opened here in Boston in Fields Corner. And this like opens a lot of doors for communities to really get together and rethink what their streets are and what they're meant to be. So that was like 20 minutes of me talking straight. I'm gonna look in the chat to see what else has been coming in. Okay. Ped walk signs, yep. Nice intersections. There's a lot of different things. Urban contacts. Yep. Okay. Okay, this is a lot of different topics. I'm gonna start with the ones that came in first because that made it easier. So a few things. The MUTCD doesn't tell you how to design a street. It tells you if you've decided what you're going to do, here's the right size sign, and here is the width of the lane marking that you need to use. So when it comes to whether it should be a signalized intersection or a roundabout, the manual is agnostic. It says like you figured that out. If you've decided that it's going to be a roundabout, these are the signs that you should use. Same thing for a question in here around whether signals should be on a post, overhead, on a mast arm. Those decisions are made by the engineer. There are some rules that they have to follow that the manual sets out. So you can't just have like one signal. For example, you always have to have a secondary so that if one is blocked or in sight lines or for whatever reason stops working, the other one is still there. Although honestly, the way that traffic signals work, if one stops, the others do too. Related is a question in here about this Google product that the city of Boston has been using called Green Light for Streets or Green Light for Great Streets. I don't quite remember. That's basically using and processing big data to make recommendations on relatively minor changes to how long traffic gets a green light. Those are not, that kind of decision making isn't something that the manual tells you what to do. Those are things that get passed down either from MassDOT in our context here, or your city traffic engineer or whoever's kind of making those decisions for your community. I know in some places, like the police department is tasked with things that really should be an engineering decision. Policy around how people are prioritized in intersections is something that your jurisdiction that owns that intersection makes the decision on. The manual says things like you have to provide a minimum of 7 seconds for a certain type of like walk signal, but it doesn't say it must come up every time. That said, there are things that the manual really kind of flubbed on that I hope we'll be able to make some changes in the future around signals. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through slides. I have this on pause so that you can't see me scrolling through, but I'm trying to find if I have some slides around what the traffic signals are. I'm just going to stop sharing because that's taking too much of my time. The manual does not require pedestrian signal heads, nor does it require marked crosswalks at every intersection. It recommends marking crosswalks, but it also says an engineer should decide whether they think it's appropriate or not. Some engineers will be like, yeah, of course. Others will be like, no, never, even in the same context. So that's where some of the work that you all engage in is really important, because it's sharing what your priorities are as residents of a community and people who use an intersection. So there's flexibility, and there's definitely a way to do more and do better than the minimums. But that's really something that is decided at the like engineer level, or honestly, at a elected official or appointed official level. A lot of times they'll make those kinds of decisions for you. Okay, there are more audio and visual signals at crosswalks. So this is and curb cuts. So those are actually not super well addressed in the manual, because those are addressed in the long waiting to be formally adopted by all of the federal agencies document called PROWAG, or which is put out by the U.S. Access Board, which is an independent federal agency. The U.S. Access Board issued a final rulemaking on PROWAG, which determines the accessibility features that are required in the public right-of-way, like curb cuts or curb ramps, as some people call them, as well as the accessible pedestrian signals and the tactile strips that you'll see at the base of the ramps that help indicate to people with visual disabilities that they have like reached kind of a yield, check out what's happening situation. The manual does a decent job of cross-referencing what was in the what's in PROWAG. There was kind of a delay in the manual coming out, actually, because the two agencies were required to coordinate a little bit closer before the manual got published. Accessibility is required by law. You can't just be like, I'm not doing it. You can and will hopefully get sued. And as a city, it is your responsibility by law, by federal law, to provide accommodations for people with disabilities. The issue then becomes like, well, but how? And that is where PROWAG comes in and really gives you more details on that. I know there's a lot of disappointment in the transportation, like the urban transportation, like suburban, sort of like developed areas transportation world, as well as in the disabilities world, around how little the manual goes beyond what's already there. ProAg is great. It has a lot of details about how to design curb ramps so that people in wheelchairs and using other mobility devices aren't like struggling, aren't hitting lips, like aren't leaning backwards, like falling over, as well as placement of accessible pedestrian signals, which are those buttons that like make a noise. They also vibrate. So if you keep your hand on them, when it's going, you'll feel it. So if you also can't hear, you'll know that it's your turn to go. But ProAg was written, honestly, like I think the version that it got adopted by the US Access Board in 2023 is largely the same as the draft that has been around also for over 15 years. There are some new stuff, new things that are in ProAg and in the MUTCD specific to temporary traffic conditions. This is when there's construction and the like pedestrian way is closed or there's a detour. There are some new requirements or suggested requirements. I don't want to misspeak about providing audio visual information about when sidewalks are closed. But this is where Carol's question gets to the heart of the matter. Does ProAg say that all crosswalks should have audio visual signals? ProAg says, look at the MUTCD, and the MUTCD says basically, look at your engineer to decide. So those pedestrians, if you don't have a pedestrian signal head, you can't have like an audible pedestrian signal because there's no pedestrian signal to be audible about. And the MUTCD doesn't require that. However, there is, I think a lot of people on the call maybe are familiar with how disability advocates across the country for decades now have, basically sued local governments for not implementing accessibility requirements with a very specific focus on curb ramps. That is like a really beautiful and long history of advocacy and an unfortunately long history of advocacy that still hasn't been fully rectified, and lots of cities are still working on that. But there is sort of a growing movement to get cities to think more seriously about those audio and tactile signals for people with visual disabilities or hearing disabilities. So those are becoming more common. I know here in Boston, we've had a long-standing effort to install them. Most signals have them by now, although not all. But there are other jurisdictions in the US that have done nothing on that. So there is more work that's coming and more guidance on the best way to implement these requirements, because again, accessibility is required by law. It's not just because ProAg has or hasn't been finalized by USDOT, the Department of Transportation, or by the Department of Justice. So you do have to do that and kind of like do your best. For me, in my role at NACTO, I came into the organization when we were, I don't know, like 50% of the way through an update to our urban bikeway design guide. And this is bikeway design, but there's a lot of interaction with pedestrians and thinking about how to design streets and intersections that work for a lot of different people. So for my organization, we really focused in on making sure that we were demonstrating best practices and lifting up the ways that cities should be thinking about accessible design when they're undertaking a street design project. And we'll keep doing stuff like that too. So keep an eye out for those kinds of contexts. So there's a question in here about applying in a suburban context, roadways that are narrow and a population that is interested in seeing bike infrastructure, traffic calming, and general improved pedestrian safety. So the MUTCD allows all of those things. There is nothing that says that you can't do more or do better than. That is really where like all of you and your voices come in, is telling your the folks who are technically working for you, your elected officials, your city or town staff, that, hey, like, we need to have bike lanes to get from the park to the grocery store, because how else am I supposed to stock up on popsicles in the summer, right? We need to have a crosswalk that drivers have to stop at, because we have so many kids who are crossing back and forth from the school to the park. Or, you know, here's like a senior living community that needs to have access to the grocery store. You can tell that I haven't had lunch. I keep thinking about food examples here. That's none of that is, the manual says nothing about like you can't do that. You absolutely can. And I think that's what maybe I didn't do a great job, but at the very beginning, what I really wanted to emphasize is like you can do a ton of stuff. It is engineering judgment at the end of the day, which can be established through an engineering study as well. So there are some rules, but there are ways to break basically every single rule that the manual puts forward, so long as you have a supportive and engaged community and staff who are willing to see things through. Distinguishing signalized from unsignalized intersections. We have many crosswalks at unsignalized intersections, so can't have walk signals. So there are some things, so intersections can always become signalized. They don't always have to stay unsignalized, even mid-block crosswalks. The manual in my organization's view hasn't gone far enough in giving flexibility to local engineers, designers who are most familiar with your context to be able to make the decision about the best, if a signal should be installed, because of something called warrants. Warrants are requirements that you have to meet in order to install a traffic signal. And I say requirements because that's what people who have read the manual, have been trained on the manual for years, think they are. But again, there is no rule in the manual that can't be broken or things that you can't do. If a local jurisdiction decides that the crosswalk should have a full stop of traffic, of vehicular traffic, you could do it. It's expensive. I will say that traffic signals are expensive, but that doesn't, you know, that's a different problem. That's a finding the money, applying for grants, going to your metropolitan planning organization, your district office at MassDOT. That's that problem. But there's nothing that says if you have a busy crosswalk that you can't make it a raised crosswalk, that you can't add an RRFB, that you can't do a full signal. So I hope that answered that question. And if it didn't, feel free to add more. Okay, I think that I've answered a lot of the questions in the chat. We still have like 20 minutes, so if there's more, please feel free, or Brendan or Emma, if you've seen anything that I didn't get into, let me know. Oh, I
Brendan,
see you have a...
you just want to open up to people to be able to speak instead of to the chat? Is that okay with you too?
Yeah, I think we can keep the recording going. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So there's another question. Can we have signage that doesn't appear in the MUTCD? Yes. Super simple answer. Actually, you can do all kinds of different signs, especially like warning signs. Those are the ones that are yellow, or signs that basically aren't white. When you see a white sign, that's a regulatory sign. That means like you have to follow a certain kind of rule. Yellow signs are just warnings. So you can like basically do whatever you want on those signs. I know I had a project in a neighborhood when I worked for the city of Boston, where neighbors had installed like a little cat crossing sign. I absolutely had our engineers draw like a real like warning sign with a cat on it to replace that one, because we can. There are absolutely no rules that say you can't. You can change the words if you want. Those are like really much more flexible than other requirements in the manual. And you don't need to necessarily do exactly what's in the book on signs, with some exceptions, I will say. Yes, Brendan just put a really cute, so those are in my neighborhood too. People put little cat stickers on them. That I swear that's not me. That wasn't something that I tried to change. That's just someone who puts a sticker on. But yeah, like best practices are developed like with research theoretically and like user engagement. So a lot of times signs in the manual do have that kind of background of like, actually, we have talked to people, we've done user experiments, and like, this is the sign that makes the most sense. But I say that and I hold that truth at the same time as saying and holding the truth that some of the signs that are in the manual are just completely like someone was like, this seems cool, let's make a sign that says this. There's a good example of this in the 11th edition. So some of you may be familiar with signs that say bikes use full lane. They've changed the words slightly. Bikes may make use of full lane. And it's just like such a minor change that is kind of meaningless and just adds more words that has no background. So I say both things at the same time. As far as the APS signs, those do have some good research behind them, thankfully. So please don't change those too much, although the cat stickers are fine because they're flat and if you're touching it, you can't feel it.
I think there was a good question from Nina Garfinkel. Why do people just
Yes.
follow minimums rather than maximums?
So that's a very philosophical question. The manual itself, I think, tries to do a lot of things. It tries to be, applicable in every context. And that's kind of impossible, even in a book that is a really dense 1,100 pages of content. One of the things it's different depending what state you're in. In Massachusetts, our state law is actually a little bit kinder to engineers in what they're liable for. But in other states, and even here, I know examples of where your municipal engineer or the engineer of record, the person who signed the plans and put their stamp on it, are liable for injury and fatality that happens on the roadway. It's a really serious issue. I think a lot of people don't want to color outside of the lines or think that they're coloring outside of the lines for fear of potentially creating a situation that's worse, and where someone could get hurt. And that's like a very real feeling that I don't want to diminish. And I do want to recognize that that's like a professional liability and like weight that our engineers have to hold. And so I think that holds a lot of people back of like, well, the minimum that's required by the manual is this. And so we're going to just go by that, because then when you are brought to court, you have this like document that has this like pretty massive backing that says that you followed the practices, you did exactly what it said, and like this is an outcome, but it would be out of your control because you followed this federal guidance. But that's also why it's important for this document to be updated and to reflect better practices so that more people do feel comfortable and don't have that professional liability of potentially creating a situation that could be dangerous. Carol has her hand up.
Yeah, a few things, Stephanie. Thank you. I'm reacting one to David, is that you, from Brookline, that you said that the Cambridge, you press a button to get the audible. But I was just thinking, how does a visually impaired person who needs the audible recognize that? Or if they're alone, because it's in writing, right? As opposed to just having it happen automatically.
Yeah. So part of the problem with it being
Yeah.
in words is that That also assumes that you understand English, which isn't what a lot of people in Massachusetts communities, there's a lot of Spanish speakers, for example. There are a lot of people who speak English but aren't necessarily able to read it all that well. So I think the sign on the audible signal that Cambridge uses, which David rightly points out, says push button to get audible signal, is very clear, assuming you know English. But there are also
Assuming you can see.
yes, and assuming you can see. That is where so this is where things get a little contentious, and it's mostly because of neighbors. They don't like, so those things can also make a little pinging noise to let you know that it's available. But adding that pinging noise, people find annoying. And so there's a balance that you have to strike between accessibility and getting endless phone calls from people who are annoyed because the button is making a noise. When I lived in Chicago, they introduced audible signals on bus shelters to say, like, to read the text that said the next bus is in 10 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever it is. And those, just beeped constantly, and people had a real problem with that. But that's how you would know that it's there. And so there is something called travel training that people with disabilities have available to them, where their common routes get mapped out, and they have like support to help them like know where buttons are and to feel confident and comfortable moving independently through spaces. That doesn't, one, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have universal accessibility, and two, it obviously doesn't cover any situations where you've never been to this community before and you're like shut out of understanding how to navigate it, and that's a real serious issue. David, because your name was brought up, you should definitely talk.
I have two more other things.
Yeah,
Let's hear from David first. Yeah.
well, I think that my point was maybe misunderstood. What I'm saying is that we have finally reached agreement a couple of years ago where in the dense parts of Brookline, the walk signals will come on automatically. Yet we have sign on every single button that says push the button to get the walk signal. And what I'm saying is, as we move into more residential areas, this is actually causing pushback from residences where, because people who go by those, they think they have to push the button to get the walk signal. They don't. We're telling people to do something that's not necessary. It's irritating the residents and it's causing pushback. We do not want that pushback. We tell people in English, the different language is a separate issue. What I'm saying is in English, we're telling people to do something they don't need to do. I have seen signs that give better, clear instructions of what is necessary. In answer to the question of how will a person who can't read see that, well, if you have an accessible pedestrian signal, it has a certain shape, it has an arrow on it, it'll have a locator tone so you can find it. Once you reach it, you will get audible signals back and forth. Blind people, I've walked the streets with multiple blind people, so we know this, they're well trained. And so the English language is to help people who are sighted to understand what the button is there for.
Ah, okay.
And right now we're telling people the wrong thing.
Yeah, those words can be changed. There's nothing that says they must be the words that that are in Brookline and not the words that are in Cambridge. The words that are
Yeah, it
in
was
Cambridge
just
are
a
much
previous
clearer.
administration told me we couldn't use those accurate signs because they weren't, that language was not approved by the MUTCD. That's what I was told.
Yes, that is not necessarily true, is the answer. Carol.
Yeah, I just had two other things. I did ask the question, is there some kind of standard requirement about how long a walk signal should be on? Because there are some intersections, they go off really fast. And for someone in a wheelchair, that's tough. And the other thing is, I was on the Massachusetts Access Board, the Architectural Access Board, just so everybody knows, they have a lot of requirements of curb cuts in particular. And crosswalks, that there have to be curb cuts at the end of them, etc. I don't know if they have a requirement for audible or visual signals. I actually don't know that. But
They do.
okay, thank you.
Sorry, did I miss a question? Did I miss a different question?
Oh, about how long do walk signals
Oh,
have?
yes. Okay. Yes, there are requirements. One of the things that I personally find frustrating is this like walk signal issue because so you are required to have the pedestrian walk like human figure on for a minimum period of time. That's usually 7 seconds, although there are some places where you could fudge that a little bit shorter. That has a minimum time, but the amount of time for the countdown, which is the do not walk phase, could be a really long time. But the manual also reinforces this understanding of what those things mean to say that the walk, the pedestrian white symbol is the only time that you should begin to enter an intersection. Whereas like, you know, as a person, if you've been to an intersection before and you're like, that countdown says 30 seconds, I know it's going to take me 10. You enter the crosswalk anyway. So there's like a mismatch there between what the manual thinks it's telling people and how people are actually interacting, which is preventing more cities from doing what Washington, D.C. did at scale. And now actually has to, like, as they update signals, change it. But if you've been to Washington, D.C., or Cambridge, honestly, the walk signal comes up at the same time as the countdown does. And so you know from as soon as the walk goes on how much time you have. Cambridge also has spent, well, one, has fewer overall signalized intersections. I want to emphasize that Cambridge is amazing, but is still a small community and has a lot of things in its control that others like Boston don't necessarily have. Where they have done the work to update the traffic controller, which is the computer in the box, and the other equipment on the street, such that you don't encounter situations where what we would call like the pedestrian signal gaps out, which is where the ped signal turns off, but the green light is still on for vehicles, or it's mistimed in other ways. That is all like technology. That's all that is. And that's choices, that's policy choices that you're making about both your investments as well as how much you're going to prioritize pedestrian time at, I want to be clear, at the expense of moving traffic through an intersection. A lot of people think that you can do both. You can't do both. You can either move pedestrians and give them more time, or you can have a lot more traffic flow through and hit a level of service for vehicles that is higher. That's a policy decision. That's something that everyone in this room can advocate to weigh more heavily towards pedestrians. There is a minimum there is a maximum walking speed, I should say, of 3.5 feet per second, which is down already from 4 feet per second, which is what it used to be. There is nothing that says you can't go lower than that. And there's even some guidance, so an option to say like 3 feet per second in places where you have more, you expect to have more slower moving traffic. So children, older adults, people with disabilities who are just moving slower, people who are just strolling. But you can always go lower than that, and you can always time your signal longer. There's nothing that says that the time can only be as long as it takes for someone to cross the street. There's nothing that says that. It's just a common, like, I'm balancing things, so I'm just going to give the amount of time that it takes for a person who's already at the curb to cross the street, which is already less consideration than we give to vehicles, because we think about vehicles who are far away from the intersection being able to get through on a single green light. But we don't think about pedestrians who are maybe like a quarter of a block away and see it and are like kind of jogging and want to be able to cross the street. Too bad. Like, we don't think about you. You have to already be there. So I now I'm like editorializing, but there are more questions. Betsy has had her hand up.
Is there any guidance related to four-way stops, or particularly as a traffic a vehicle slowing method, to put a have mid-block stop signs on a straightaway?
So I would say like a mid-block stop sign is unlikely. That is because it's confusing. So normally to users who see a stop sign, they're expecting other types of vehicular traffic. That said, there are a couple of ways that you could work around that. In my head, one of them would be if you had a path, like a shared use path, you could say, well, now it's a four-way intersection with the path. And so path users maybe get the yield sign and the vehicle users get a stop sign. And that's a way to kind of like trick it into becoming an intersection. But just one crosswalk that's mid-block that doesn't like connect to the rest of the network is a lot harder to justify in that same way. Similarly, because it doesn't necessarily connect to obviously it connects to the sidewalk network, but beyond the sidewalk, it doesn't. There isn't a network warrant for pedestrians in the book, and that's something that like I work on. Is coming up with other ways to think about demand across a network to be able to allow that kind of situation. But there are other tools to improve that mid-block crosswalk and to slow people down, right? There's speed humps, raised crosswalks, curb extensions, fewer travel lanes, adding pedestrian crossing islands in the middle of the crosswalk. Like there are a lot of tools that the
But
manual is
signs
just
are
like,
the
yeah.
cheapest, but signs are the cheapest, is what we've found.
Yeah, but I think signs
And
are
they can be done
also the
on a
most
90-day
ignored.
trial. So they're
Yeah.
willing to.
Yeah, but I would also say
We're
signs are
pushing
pretty
for that at
ignored.
this point because we can't get them to be willing to spend the money on all the other things.
Yeah. I mean, if you could try to make it an intersection, maybe you could get an argument there, but I think I don't know. My experience
Okay,
with stop
I
signs is
like
that
that
people don't
idea.
stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right,
Okay,
Steph, it looks
Brendan.
like we have, yes, it looks
Yes.
like we have one more hand up.
there.
We are at the end of the hour, so if people need to drop, completely understand. But it looks like Johnny has his hand up. If
We're gonna get Stefanie back again.
Anytime.
Yes,
John.
very quickly.
Yep.
I want to backtrack to crossing signals. I mean, anecdotally, I live in a community that is predominantly people of color, and our like walking signals are significantly shorter than whiter, wealthier neighborhoods. I think I was trying to sort of like discern if there was like a formula, and I think you might have alluded to some of that. It's frustrating and also just like challenging for older folks. And I'm like, is this designed this way? I mean, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
it is a policy choice, but I'm wondering what are some of the solutions? It's crazy when I'm like, you know, trying to cross what feels like 50 feet of an intersection, and the walk sign, the man walking or the person walking is there for like 7 seconds or whatever, and then the countdown is 10. But when I'm in like Boston, some of the wider, or downtown Boston, some of the wider, wealthier neighborhoods like Back Bay, they have like 30 seconds or maybe a fourth of that. How do we? I'm sure I'm not the only one that's observed things like this. I'm wondering, like, what is the solution to things like that?
Yeah. So a couple of things to know just as like background. So as I mentioned before, the formula used to calculate the minimum pedestrian time was updated. But even here in Boston, what I have found is like the further away from downtown, or the more like one-off the traffic signal is, the less likely that it's been updated in decades, right? Like the traffic signal infrastructure is still there. There's no need for anyone to go out there. Then they're not going to go out there and change it. So there is very much a policy piece here of like recognizing and stating like the racism behind like you've made choices to listen to residents who know who to contact to ask for changes, and you haven't expanded your look to other communities that don't yet know or will never know, like, or feel comfortable making those kinds of asks. The other thing, and like the kind of like deep, dirty secret of downtown Boston pedestrian times, for most of those intersections, the amount of time that pedestrians get is actually dictated by the amount of vehicle traffic. So when the pedestrian has more time, it's almost always because we're trying to give more time for vehicle traffic to cross that intersection too. So we'll say we need to get X number of vehicles through the intersection every cycle, and that will demand 35, 40, 50 seconds out of the entire traffic signal time. And then because we have done more concurrent crossings where pedestrians can go at the same time as vehicles who are going in the same direction, you just leave the pedestrian signal on until the traffic is cleared of the intersection. And that's like kind of backwards to me, right? Like I think pedestrian needs to come first, but that is oftentimes how decisions get made. So those are two things that I'll note about that. I think maybe I'll pitch to Brendan in these like overtime minutes here of like, I could do a whole presentation on traffic signal timing and like how that gets done and like
I
really
think that would be good.
go through that. Yeah.
I think that would be fantastic. Like I've always wanted to be like, gosh, like is there a easy Excel formula that we could share with people for like, hey, my street is 40 feet wide. What's the recommended time like to maximize pedestrian time, like that we could just share and people could plug it in themselves and stuff like that? Because I feel there are so many things out there that are so confusing. So like if you want to share with us, and then also you could just like give a couple examples of different ways you could time streets. I think that would be really, really useful.
Yeah, happy to.
Cool. Yeah, let's think about a future time to do this. Maybe at the end of the year, like in December or something like that. So yeah.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, happy holidays. Hey, here's
traffic signal
celebrate
timing and
holiday
phasing
lights
101.
and yeah. Well, Stefanie, thank you so much for making the time today to do this. We really appreciate it. And hope everyone enjoys the rest of their August.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Stephanie.